June 1914. Europe was in the midst of an idyllic summer. The nations of Europe, fierce rivals in the competition for colonies around the world and for the prerogatives of imperial power, were also joined together by webs of trade and capital. Their royal houses linked by bonds of family and marriage. Global trade was at an all-time high. The economic interdependence that a century later we would call globalisation was an undisputed fact of life. The prospect of an all-out European war was unthinkable, the pundits said. Laughable, said the politicians. Nothing could happen that couldn't be resolved by the diplomats at some stylish European resort. No one saw the catastrophe coming. No one thought such a catastrophe was possible until it came. The Great War, the war to end all wars, the war of Western civilization, the European war that would grow to encompass virtually the entire world and ultimately force 90% of the world's population to choose sides, would prove to be a cataclysm beyond anything that anyone had imagined. By the time it had ended, over 16 million people had lost their lives. A total of 70 million men took up arms. 9 million never returned. Another 36 million were wounded. The war left in its wake unparalleled devastation. The economic cost of fighting it was estimated at the time at $186 billion. The damage it left in its wake was estimated at another $151 billion. The total of $337 billion in modern 21st century dollars represents a sum of between 17 trillion and $35 trillion. An amount so staggering as to be virtually incomprehensible. The war would shatter the peace of Europe for the better part of a century. It would give rise to another, even more devastating war in less than a generation, lead to a Cold War that would divide the continent of Europe for almost 50 years, and on more than one occasion bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. He was a boy, 18 years old, a poor student. He was thin, sickly, and suffered from tuberculosis. Gavrilo Princip was an unlikely candidate to start a world war that would bring down 4 royal houses and their empires and leave millions of dead in its wake. But that is exactly what he did. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie paid an official visit to Sarajevo. They were there to inspect the Austrian troops garrisoned there. His trip had been announced in the local papers weeks before. His route was common knowledge. He and his entourage traveled in open-top vehicles. There was no security, no protection, no precautions were taken. A secret Bosnian society committed to forcing the union of Bosnia's Serbs with the Kingdom of Serbia, named Unification or Death, decided to use the opportunity of the Archduke's visit to strike a blow for Serbian unification. Operating under the moniker the Black Hand and secretly funded and supplied by elements within the Serbian government, they recruited a half-dozen young men, supplied them with pistols and bombs, and gave them an afternoon's worth of rudimentary training. Gavrilo Princip was one of their recruits. Late on the afternoon of June 28th, Gavrilo Princip found himself standing a few feet away from the open-topped car that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were traveling in. Pulling out his pistol, barely at a distance of 5 feet, he fired 2 shots, mortally wounding the Archduke and his wife. The fuse of war had been lit. As Austrian troops in Bosnia carried out reprisal for the murder of the Archduke, the Austrian-Hungarian government in Vienna delivered to Serbia a 10-point ultimatum. The demands would have given the Austrian government carte blanche to intervene in Serbian domestic affairs at will. The language was purposely designed to be so insulting and provocative that the Serbian government would have no choice but to reject the demands out of hand. In the words of Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, it was the most formidable document ever sent from one nation to another. The Serbian government immediately accepted 8 of the points. They asked for additional time to consider the remaining 2 and proposed that the International Tribunal in The Hague arbitrate the last remaining points. As a precaution, the Serbian government ordered the full mobilization of the Serbian army. Vienna refused to accept any further delay. Citing the Serbian unwillingness to immediately accept all 10 of the Austrian demands, on July 28th, barely a month after the assassination of the Archduke, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia and ordered a partial mobilization of its army. The cataclysm had begun. Russia, under its Tsar Nicholas II, styling itself the protector of the Slavic peoples of which the Serbs were part, declared that it would come to the aid of Serbia if Austria invaded it. Urged on by his generals, Nicholas ordered a partial mobilization of the Russian army. Faced with German threats to stand down or face war with Germany as well, on July 30th, Nicholas II ordered a full mobilization of Russian forces along the 1,000-mile common border with Austria-Hungary and Germany. On August 1st, citing the ongoing Russian mobilization, Germany declared war on Russia. Simultaneously, Berlin issued an ultimatum to the French government, pledged to remain neutral or face war with Germany as well. On August 3rd, in the absence of any response from the French government, Germany declared war against France as well. Simultaneously, Germany demanded that Belgium allow the free transit of German troops across its soil, or it would be treated as an enemy. Less than 24 hours later, advanced elements of the German army crossed the Belgian frontier. At the stroke of midnight, in the absence of a German guarantee to respect Belgian neutrality, Great Britain declared war on Germany and began the mobilization of its army and navy. It had been 35 days since Gavrilo Princip, an 18-year-old boy, had pulled the trigger that had killed the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. It was only 14 days since Austria-Hungary had issued its ultimatum to Serbia. All over Europe, war fever was raging. Each new declaration of war triggered new spontaneous celebrations of support across Europe's capitals. Across Europe, millions of soldiers were taking positions along their frontiers. The unthinkable had happened. The cataclysm had begun. By the first week of August, Europe was in the grips of an all-out mobilization. Millions of men were on the march. On August 4th, in accordance with the master plan outlined by the chief of the German General Staff in 1905, Count Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, 75 German divisions assembled across the French-Belgian border. 55 of those divisions intended to sweep across Belgium, then pivot at the English Channel and descended to France in a drive toward Paris. The remaining 20 divisions took up positions along the Burgundian Gap, along the borders of Alsace. The Schlieffen plan envisioned that the French army would be trapped in a giant pincer movement between the right wing of the German army and the center and left wings. Once trapped, the hammer of the right wing would descend against the anvil of the left and center wings and annihilate the French army. The Schlieffen plan envisioned that the French army would be destroyed and France forced to surrender within 6 weeks. With France vanquished, Germany would turn its military power to the Eastern Front and deal with Russia. Over 90% of German military strength was earmarked for the initial attack in the West. It did not go as planned. Invading Belgium, German forces were quickly stopped by the defensive fortifications built around the city of Liège. The city lay squarely in the path of the advancing German army. Heavy artillery, including two mighty Krupp-built 420mm siege howitzers, were brought up to attack the forts defending Liège. After 12 days of furious bombardment, the city capitulated. The road west was now open, but the carefully planned German schedule was already in disarray. Now, unexpectedly, British troops began to show up on the Belgian front lines. At Namur, the Belgian defensive forts around the city again delayed the Germans. The siege lasted until August 23rd. Only then could the German army continue its advance. 6 weeks to Paris and victory was still possible, but the German army had suffered heavy losses and the advance had been delayed. The quick, easy thrust through Belgium had been neither quick nor easy. By the end of August, troops of the German right wing had crossed in numbers into France and were beginning to advance towards Paris. As the German First and Second Armies approached Paris, they cut the corner of the proposed German advance and swerved southeast away from Paris in order to swallow the retreating French armies. In the process, they exposed their right flank and opened up a 30-mile gap between the German First and Second Armies. The French commander, General Jean Joffre, seeing the opportunity, prepared to pounce on the German army. He ordered the French Sixth Army of 150,000 men and the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, with 70,000 men to take up positions along the Marne River. On September the 5th, he launched his attack. As troops from the French Sixth Army and the BEF poured through the gap in the German lines, the French Fifth Army attacked the flank of the German Second Army. For 3 days, from September 6th through the 8th, the battle, and with it the success of the German drive, hung in the balance. Jean Joffre ordered all available reserves brought up to the front, including the garrison in Paris. Lacking sufficient transport, he commandeered the Paris taxicab fleet to ferry the troops to the front line. By September 9th, it looked like it would be the German army that would be encircled and destroyed. Finally, the German General Staff ordered a retreat 40 miles back to the River Aisne. The German drive on Paris had been stopped. The Schlieffen plan was in tatters. Now began the so-called race to the sea. Each of the opposing forces attempted to outflank the other by extending their trench systems. A series of bloody but inconclusive battles, culminating in the First Battle of Ypres, failed to dislodge either side. By the end of November, a system of fortified trenches extended along a 200-mile frontier from the English Channel to the Franco-Swiss border. On the other side of those trenches, German forces now occupied French territory that accounted for 66% of France's iron production, 25% of its steel-making ability, and almost 50% of its coal output. 6 weeks to Paris and victory, the strategic essence of the Schlieffen plan had been exposed as a failure. The first phase of the war had ended. The Allied attempt to halt the German drive and save Paris had succeeded, but at an almost incomprehensible cost. In the first 5 months of the war, the French army had suffered casualties of 955,000 men. German losses had been just short of 900,000. The original British detachment in the British Expeditionary Force had been virtually wiped out. If this was victory, it seemed little better than defeat. But this was only the beginning. It would get worse, much worse. No one could yet imagine the horrors that were to come. For the next 3 years, 2 words would best describe the war on the Western Front: stalemate and slaughter. The German drive on Paris had failed. In that sense, they had been defeated, but they had not yet been vanquished. For the Allies, a German defeat was not the same as an Allied victory. German forces still controlled the industrial heartland of France, and the Allies seemed incapable of rolling back the German tide. For the next 3 years, each side would look for a decisive breakthrough that would allow it to outflank its opponent, surround its forces, and destroy them. Relying mostly on massed infantry attacks across a no-man's land of barbed wire obstacles and minefields, and preceded by a preparatory attack of sustained artillery bombardment, both sides continued to pour men into a meat grinder, seemingly indifferent to the mounting and unsustainable human losses. The horror was just beginning. In the spring of 1915, German forces began a sustained attack on the Belgian town of Ypres. The town was critical in the defense of the Channel ports that the British Expeditionary Force relied on for its supplies. Ypres had been the last major battle in 1914. It would become the first major battle of 1915. It would also go down in history for a far more sinister reason. It was at Ypres that the German army unleashed the industrial age's first weapon of mass destruction, poison gas. German troops hauled up 6,000 cylinders of chlorine gas, each weighing 90 pounds, a total of 168 tons. On a pre-arranged signal, they opened the cylinders. Within minutes, a cloud of green gas began to form and slowly began drifting towards the Allied lines. Within minutes, 6,000 French troops were dead or dying from asphyxiation or lung damage. Many more were blinded. The heavy gas hugged the ground, filling the trenches and forcing the men out in the open. Without protection, they were easy prey for German snipers. The chaos caused by the gas attack opened up a 4-mile gap in the Allied lines. The German commanders, surprised by the effectiveness of the gas attack, had brought up insufficient reserves to be able to exploit the gap. Canadian troops were quickly rushed into the breach. Lacking gas masks, they improvised, urinating on hand towels and holding them to their faces. But this was only the beginning. The First War of the Industrial Age had many more horrors in its arsenal. In September 1915, the French army mounted an attack against German forces in Champagne. Simultaneously, British Field Marshal Douglas Haig launched the Battle of Loos. This time, it would be the Allies that would unleash poison gas. Believing that German gas masks were poorly designed and constructed, the British released 140 tons of chlorine gas against the German lines. The initial attack went well, and British forces were able to advance along a broad front and took control of the town of Loos. The next day, the Germans brought up reinforcements and counterattacked. The battle raged off and on for weeks before Haig halted the attack. British losses were staggering, 50,000 men dead or wounded. German losses were half that number. As 1916 dawned, the continued stalemate on the Western Front led the German General Staff to prepare a new plan. In a Christmas Day letter to the Kaiser, Erich von Falkenhayn, the Chief of Staff of the German Army, laid out a new strategy. First, in order to starve Great Britain and force it out of the war, he proposed that Germany adopt a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare against all merchant shipping, both combatants and neutrals. Secondly, he argued for a sustained attack on the French fortress town of Verdun. This was the key fortification in what had traditionally been the invasion route into northern France. The French would never allow the fortress to fall, he reasoned. There, they would be bled white until France was exhausted. The combination of starving Great Britain into submission and a decisive defeat for French forces at Verdun would open the way to a German victory on the Western Front. On February 21, 1916, the German Fifth Army, under the command of Crown Prince Wilhelm, the heir to the German throne, began one of the biggest battles of the war. On the German side, 1 million men were positioned along the west bank of the Meuse River. The attack was preceded by a 21-hour bombardment. 1,400 guns fired 100,000 shells every hour. Over 2 million shells fell in the day preceding the attack along an 8-mile front. The Germans were convinced that no one could survive the massive bombardment. It failed. Miraculously, half the defenders remained in place. By the end of the first day, the Germans had succeeded only in taking the French front-line trenches. When the French counterattacked, the Germans unveiled a new and horrifying weapon: flamethrowers. They could fire only for a short time, and they were useless when empty, but they were horrifying nonetheless. By the second day, the unrelenting German attack had succeeded in overcoming the next line of the trenches. The French defenders had now been pushed back into within 5 miles of Verdun. The outer ring of forts was still holding. More French reinforcements were on their way. When one of the outer forts surrendered, the French Supreme Commander Joffre reminded his subordinates that any man who ceded ground to the Germans would be immediately court-martialed. The surrender of Verdun was unthinkable. Joffre appointed Philippe Pétain to command the overall defense of the Verdun sector. "They shall not pass," Pétain assured Joffre. The Germans attacked in force again on March 6th. Again, the French lines held. On April 9th, the third major German offensive against Verdun was launched. Again, Pétain's defenses held, and again, the French counterattacked. In the meantime, reinforcements continued to pour into the Verdun sector. Of the 330 active infantry regiments in the French army, 259 saw service at Verdun. Desperate, the Germans launched a deadly new chemical weapon, diphosgene gas. Much denser than chlorine gas, it was less affected by the wind. It hugged the ground with deadly effectiveness, spilling into the trenches and gassing its occupants. The gas had been developed by the brilliant German chemist Fritz Haber. When informed of its success, he threw a party for the colleagues who had helped him in its development. His wife, horrified by what her husband had done, promptly took his revolver and killed herself. The Battle of Verdun dragged on until December 1960. It had lasted for 10 months. The casualties were horrendous. Of 542,000 French casualties, 360,000 were killed and 182,000 wounded. German losses were estimated at 434,000, of which 360,000 had been killed and 74,000 wounded. By the time it was over, each army was exactly where it started. Neither side had gained any advantage. If France had bled, so too had Germany. By 1916, British casualties on the Western Front had amounted to more than 400,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. 20,000 new volunteer recruits were needed every month to replace the casualties. Troops were arriving from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. Not to mention minor colonies from all over the British Empire. More than 1 million Empire and Dominion men from the far reaches of the British Empire had been deployed. The assault that led to the Battle of the Somme had been planned as far back as late 1915. It had been intended as a joint British-French operation in order to drain the German army of reserves and reduce the pressure on Verdun. On July 1st, 1916, the British launched an offensive on an 18-mile front north of the Somme River between Arras and Albert. The date is inscribed in the annals of warfare as the bloodiest day in the history of human conflict. British casualties were 58,000. A third of them were killed. The attack was preceded by an unprecedented artillery bombardment of the German lines. The bombardment began on June 24th and continued non-stop for 8 entire days. 3,000 guns firing millions of shells were supposed to obliterate the forward German defences. It was expected that the unprecedented ferocity of the bombardment would shatter the German defences and allow the British troops to saunter across no man's land with little resistance. With the German lines shattered, the British commander Field Marshal Haig was convinced that he could deploy his cavalry to sweep around the German lines. For the first time in military history, both tanks and cavalry would be deployed simultaneously. What Haig had failed to anticipate was that even the deployment of 12,000 tons of explosive shells would be inadequate to destroy the Germans' barbed wire emplacements or robustly built concrete shelters. German troops, safely dug into the chalk hills, simply took shelter in their bunkers until the bombardment stopped. When it was over, they emerged unscathed to man their machine guns. Instead of sauntering across no man's land, the British troops were met by murderous machine gun fire. The losses were appalling. Haig, convinced that the German troops were on the verge of collapse and that victory was imminent, persisted in the attack. After 5 months of fruitless slaughter, Haig finally called off the attack. It had gained the Allies an advance of roughly 7 miles of ground. It had cost the British casualties of around 420,000 men and the French casualties of around 200,000. On the German side, losses were estimated at 500,000. As 1916 drew to a close, each side had suffered casualties of over 1 million men. The lines of trenches which defined the front line remained virtually unchanged. Millions of casualties had gained little ground. Progress was rarely measured in more than a few miles and more often than not in mere yards. The Western Front was stalemated. The horror and slaughter would continue for another year. In February 1917, in response to the failure of the Verdun campaign, the German commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to switch their strategy to one of defense in the west while concentrating the offensive effort elsewhere. They opted to rationalize the German lines in order to make them shorter and more compact. The new defensive lines, quickly christened the Hindenburg Line, ran anywhere from 3 to 30 miles behind the existing lines. Between February and April 1917, the Germans executed an orderly retreat to the Hindenburg Line. In their wake, they left a vast, desolate wasteland. The Germans' scorched earth policy had removed or destroyed anything that could have been of use to the Allies. In April 1917, the French had launched the most ambitious offensive of the war. Officially, it was called the Second Battle of the Aisne. It is remembered as the Nivelle Offensive, named after its instigator, General Robert Nivelle, the commander-in-chief of the French army. It was an utter catastrophe, and it would bring the French army to the breaking point. Nivelle amassed a force totaling 1.2 million men, supported by more than 7,000 pieces of artillery and literally millions of shells. It was designed to overwhelm the German defenders. Nivelle rashly promised that within 48 hours he would break through the German lines and win the war for France. Instead, the campaign achieved almost nothing. Little new ground was taken. Nivelle's career came to an abrupt end, and it triggered widespread mutinies within the French army. On April 16th, Nivelle ordered an assault along a 60-mile front from Soissons to Reims. Ranged against them on high ground, in well-constructed defensive positions, was the German 7th Army. The first day of the battle resulted in 40,000 French casualties, putting it almost on par with the British disaster in Lausanne a year later. There was little forward progress. A final gambit, a 4-day assault that began on May 5th, proved fruitless. On May 9th, the campaign was called off. French casualties had totaled 187,000 men. German casualties had totaled 168,000. More importantly, the morale of the French army had been shattered. Within days, widespread mutiny erupted throughout the French army. Over 20,000 men deserted their posts. It was only after repeated appeals to the men's patriotism, along with the threat of mass arrests and summary court-martials, that the men returned to the trenches. A Russian-type meltdown of the French army had been avoided, just barely. There remained, however, a marked reluctance to take part in any offensive action. In the summer of 1917, the British launched what would become one of the most controversial British operations of the entire war, the Third Battle of Ypres. Today, the battle is typically referred to as Passchendaele, after a village that fell to the Allies on November 6th. It was designed to achieve a decisive breakthrough out on the mud of Flanders. Haig was convinced that the German army was at a breaking point. He had been wrong in the Somme, and he would be proven wrong yet again at the Passchendaele. The attack began with an immense artillery bombardment. 3,000 guns fired 4.25 million shells in anticipation of the attack. On the last day of July, Haig ordered an attack along an 11-mile front against the German 4th Army. Progress was slow. German divisions, redeployed by the end of fighting on the Eastern Front, were brought in to strengthen the German defences. The battle raged for 5 months before Haig finally ordered a stop. Allied casualties were placed at 448,000 men, those of the Germans at 410,000. 1917 ended with little progress by either side, but all this was about to change. 2 factors, the imminent arrival of millions of American doughboys and the redeployment of German forces on the now settled Eastern Front, were about to transform the Western battlefield. The war still had another year to run. The death and slaughter would continue unabated, but the return of mobile warfare would herald a new and dramatic chapter in the story of the Great War. The war on the Eastern Front began with the Austrian invasion of Serbia in July 1914. It would progressively grow to encompass a vast geography from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and from the Carpathian Mountains to the Caucasus. On paper, the Russian army was a formidable force. It had at its disposal 1.2 million men, organized into 70 infantry and 24 cavalry divisions. It possessed an arsenal of almost 7,900 field guns, howitzers, and heavy guns. The German General Staff referred to it as the Russian steamroller. It seemed, at least on paper, that their fears were well placed. The Schlieffen plan had assumed that it would take the Russian military a minimum of 6 weeks to mobilize its troops. In that period, he had reasoned the German military could knock France out of the war before then turning to deal with the Russians. In less than 3 weeks, however, the Russian First and Second Armies had begun to advance into East Prussia. The German military had always anticipated the possibility of a rapid Russian advance. This advance had started earlier and was more rapid than expected. In a panic, The General Staff brought General Paul von Hindenburg out of retirement and transferred General Erich Ludendorff along with 3 corps, 75,000 men, from the Western Front. Badly outnumbered, Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to attack each of the Russian armies in turn. In Tannenberg, they surrounded the Russian Second Army and over 7 days systematically destroyed it. Out of a force of 180,000 men, 60,000 were either killed or wounded. 100,000 were captured and 10,000 escaped. The Battle of Tannenberg remains one of the most lopsided victories in the annals of warfare. The 2 German generals then turned their attention to the Russian First Army. Hindenburg attempted to outflank the Russians and surround them in the area of the Mazurkan Lakes, but they were able to execute a fighting retreat back to the protection of their border forts. The battles of Tannenberg and the Mazurkan Lakes was a triumph for the German 8th Army. In the space of a month, they had destroyed the Russian Second Army, badly mauled the Russian First Army, and ejected all Russian troops from Russian soil. The Russians fared better in the south. Under the command of Generals Nikolai Ivanov and Alexei Brusilov, Russian armies overran most of Galicia in Austrian Poland and pushed Austrian forces back 100 miles to the Carpathian Mountains. Stymied by the lack of progress on the Western Front, the German General Staff decided to make the Eastern Front the main focus of their efforts. In May 1915, German and Austrian forces launched the Görlitz-Tarnow offensive in Galicia. The campaign turned into a broader, unified offensive that resulted in the total collapse of the Russian lines and the retreat of Russian forces well into Russia. Austrian Galicia was recaptured and Russian forces were pushed back to the Ukrainian frontier. In the spring of 1916, responding to desperate French pleas to help in relieving the German pressure on Verdun, the Russians prepared to go on the offensive. In command was General Alexei Brusilov, a competent old-style commander. His main targets were the region of Russian Poland occupied by the Germans in 1915 and the Austrian-Hungarian province of Galicia. The assault into Galicia achieved a spectacular breakthrough. The decimated Austrian 8th and 9th armies fell back towards the Carpathian Mountains. More than 200,000 prisoners were taken, many of whom were Slavs who willingly deserted and joined the Russian army. Austrian morale received a blow from which it never fully recovered. By the end of September 1916, just before the onset of winter, the Brusilov offensive finally petered out. The Russian army was so war-weary that it could just not sustain the continuing losses. In 3.5 months, the Brusilov offensive had cost Russia casualties of between 1 and 1.25 million men. Equally staggering, it had caused Austria, Hungary and Germany casualties of over 1.3 million men. The Imperial Russian army was shattered and, like the population at large, rife with discontent with the government and with the family. Russia was on the verge of revolution. At the start of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, often referred to as the sick man of Europe, was in a state of terminal decline. Nominally ruled by the Turkish Sultan Muhammad V from Constantinople, effective political power was in the hands of the Turkish war minister Enver Pasha. Its far-flung provinces had increasingly been carved off by various European powers. On August 2, 1914, the Ottoman Empire signed a secret Ottoman-German alliance in which the Ottoman Empire pledged to enter the war on Germany's side one day after Germany declared war on Russia. The war with the Ottoman Empire would stretch from the Sinai to Persia and from the Caucasus to the Arabian Peninsula. One campaign in particular, however, would come to define the war between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire. Gallipoli. Early in 1950, in response to the ongoing stalemate on the Western Front, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, proposed a military operation to seize the Turkish Straits, the complex of waterways consisting of the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosporus that connected the Mediterranean Sea via the Aegean with the Black Sea. The original plan called for a combined land and naval operation to seize the Ottoman forts guarding the straits and force the passage to Constantinople. Safely anchored in the Golden Horn, Constantinople's historic anchorage, the big guns of the Royal Navy would intimidate the Ottoman government into submission. Control of the straits would open up a southern route to ship supplies to the Russian forces on the Eastern Front. In addition, the Black Sea was Russia's principal export outlet for its annual wheat crop. Success at Gallipoli, it was believed, would result in the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and knock them out of the war. The Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, reluctantly agreed to the plan. He insisted, however, that the attack be limited to the Royal Navy. The Dardanelles is 38 miles long. At the Aegean entrance, the straits are 2 miles wide and were guarded by several Ottoman forts manned with 16 heavy and 7 medium-range guns. The straits progressively widened to about 4 miles before narrowing to less than a mile at the Narrows, about 14 miles from the entrance. There, the Ottomans had placed 72 heavy guns and laid 8 separate belts of mines. Once past this gauntlet, the Allied fleet could proceed to Constantinople with little opposition. The attacking force consisted of the Royal Navy's newest dreadnought-class battleship, Queen Elizabeth, with 8 15-inch guns, and the battlecruiser Inflexible with 8 12-inch guns. In addition, there were 12 British and 4 French pre-dreadnought-class battleships. The attack plan was straightforward. The fleet would proceed to the entrance and use the big guns to destroy the forts. With the entrance secured, the fleet would proceed to the Narrows and again, using long-range gunfire from the naval guns, destroy the forts. Under cover of the bombardment, the minesweepers would clear away the mines and allow the fleet to proceed to Constantinople. The term minesweeper was a misnomer. The ships were actually civilian fishing trawlers. The bombardment began on February 25th. By the morning of the 27th, the forts were overcome and the fleet proceeded to the Narrows. In the Narrows, there was a powerful 9-knot current flowing toward the Aegean. The trawlers made little forward progress and were unable to clear any of the mines. On March 18th, Rear Admiral John de Robeck decided to proceed through the Narrows and, guns blazing, attack the forts regardless of the minefields. By the afternoon, the Ottoman big guns began to fall silent. De Robeck now ordered the French battleships to withdraw to the rear and ordered British battleships to take their place. As the French battleship Beauvais Bouvet was steaming south, she struck a mine and promptly sank with a loss of 600 men. In short order, the British ships Inflexible, Irresistible and Ocean all hit mines and were badly damaged. Unable to proceed, de Robeck recalled his force and withdrew. That should have been the end of the operation, but missions sometimes take on a life of their own. Kitchener now reversed himself. He ordered a new attack by a combination ground and naval force under the overall command of British General Sir Ian Hamilton. A vast force consisting of more than 200 ships and 75,000 men was assembled in Egypt in what would be the first amphibious operation of the war. On the 25th of April, 2 main landings were carried out. A combined British and French force attempted to land on 5 beaches on Cape Helles. They succeeded in establishing footholds in just 3. To the north, a combined force of Australian and New Zealanders, the Anzacs, were supposed to land at Aribernoo, about halfway up the peninsula. Instead, they landed a mile off target below a high ridge. Against formidable opposition, the Anzacs managed to win a bridgehead, now christened Anzac Cove, on the Aegean side of the peninsula. Bolstered by reinforcements, Turkish troops dug in on the ridgelines, overlooking the Allied positions, preventing them from getting off the beaches. Gallipoli quickly became a repetition of the stalemate on the Western Front. The initial landings had been horrifically costly. Over 20,000 men were dead or wounded, and the balance were effectively trapped on the beaches. In London, the military stalemate precipitated a political crisis. Churchill was forced to resign. Kitchener now decided that even more troops were needed. In June and July 1915, almost 50,000 fresh troops were dispatched to reinforce the 80,000 troops already in the Dardanelles. The stalemate dragged on through the summer of 1915. In August, a force of 20,000 fresh reinforcements attempted a new landing at Sulva Bay to the north. The plan was to drive across the peninsula and cut off Turkish troops to the south. The landings at Sulva Bay marked the start of a new general offensive to seize the straits. In the face of stiff Turkish resistance, the effort failed within days. The casualties were terrible. The Allies lost over 45,000 men in the first 10 days of the offensive. Ottoman losses were around 40,000. In November 1915, Kitchener gave the order for the Allied troops to be withdrawn. In January 1916, over 119,000 men were evacuated safely. Despite pouring in 500,000 men, the Allies had been unable to take control of the south of Gallipoli Peninsula, much less march on Constantinople. Allied forces had suffered over 250,000 casualties, of which 50,000 had been killed. Turkish casualties were between 250,000 and 350,000. In the end, the Gallipoli campaign achieved nothing. The Ottoman Empire was not knocked out of the war. No new lifeline to Russia was established. The Turkish military proved to be far more formidable, especially on the defensive side, than the Allies had thought possible. The only thing that did change was the continuing and ever-escalating toll of casualties. When it came to the body count, there was no stalemate. The 20 years preceding the outbreak of World War I saw a heated naval arms race between Germany and Great Britain. Beginning in 1898, Germany enacted the first of what would eventually be 5 fleet acts. Each act represented an ambitious shipbuilding program designed to greatly expand the German high seas fleet. The intent of this policy was unmistakable: to challenge the naval supremacy of the Royal Navy. Faced with an unprecedented threat to its naval superiority, Great Britain responded with a new type of battleship in 1906, the Dreadnought class. The class was named after the first ship commissioned in the new series, the HMS Dreadnought. This new type of battleship boasted an all-big gun design with an unprecedented number of large-caliber guns. Moreover, a revolutionary steam turbine propulsion system delivered superior speed. That advantage was further enhanced when the switch from coal to fuel oil further improved both the speed and the cruising range of the new ships. Historically, in warship design, naval architects opted for either big guns whose superior range allowed a ship to engage an opponent before it could in turn be engaged, or speed in order to move away from superior firepower. By offering both speed and long-range firepower, the new Dreadnought class of super battleships made all previous existing warships obsolete. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 was the largest fleet action of World War I and one of the epic naval battles of all time. The commander of the German High Seas Fleet, Admiral Reinhard Scheer, was intent on making a sortie against the British coast in a demonstration of German naval power. He was confident that his plans were unknown to the British and that he would be able to carry out his raid before the main British battle fleet in Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands could be mobilized to engage him. His confidence was misplaced. Unbeknownst to him, the Royal Navy had broken the German naval codes. Admiral of the fleet, Sir John Jellicoe, able to read Scheer's message, knew exactly what he was planning. Scheer was not looking for a decisive naval action, simply a propaganda victory to showcase German naval strength. The Royal Navy offered the opportunity to ambush the German High Seas Fleet, prepared for the most important naval battle since Trafalgar. On May 30th, the British Grand Fleet put to sea. From the 4th of 4th, under the command of British Admiral David Beatty, sailed 6 battle cruisers, 4 fast battleships, 14 light cruisers, and 27 destroyers. The main British force, under Jellicoe's command, consisted of 24 battleships, 3 battle cruisers, and 51 destroyers, came from the Moray Firth and Scapa Flow. On the same day, more than 100 ships of the German High Seas Fleet left their home port. This stage was set for the biggest fleet action of the Great War. At 2:20 p.m. the following day, British and German cruiser squadrons clashed off the Danish coast in Jutland. Admiral Fritz von Hipper, commander of the German cruiser squadron, immediately turned south to rejoin Scheer's main force. Beatty, in hot pursuit of Hipper's squadron, now made a classic military mistake. He signaled his fast attack cruisers to steam ahead and engage the German ships, while his slower battleships followed behind. In the meantime, as if anticipating Beatty's poor decision, Jellicoe had dispatched 3 of his fastest cruisers to rush to Beatty's aid. As Hipper and Beatty fought their way south, engaged in a running naval battle, the British lost the battle cruisers Queen Mary and Indefatigable to superior German gunfire. Just after 4:30 p.m., Beatty received an ominous message. His scouting destroyers had spotted the main German High Seas Fleet of 16 battleships, 6 older pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 light cruisers, and 31 torpedo boats surging towards him. Hopelessly outgunned, Beatty called off the attack. With a screen of destroyers behind him, he steamed north at full speed. The entire German fleet, now in hot pursuit, inflicted significant losses on his battle group. In the meantime, the 3 fast cruisers dispatched by Jellicoe were steaming south. Through a navigational error, they missed linking up with Beatty's retreating squadron. Instead, they suddenly found themselves on the right flank of the German main force. In one of the fortuitous events on which great battles sometimes turn, the British cruisers caught the German fleet by surprise and badly mulled the German screening cruisers. It was not Scheer's turn to be confused. Responding to reports that the main British fleet had been sighted on his flank, Scheer turned to meet the threat. This put him perpendicular to the main body of the approaching British fleet. Shortly after 6 p.m., the main forces of the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet engaged. With his greater speed, Jellicoe crossed the T on the German fleet twice. Attacking perpendicular to the main body of the German fleet, he was able to bring all of his guns to bear. Twice, he sent broadside after broadside at the column of German ships. Scheer finally ordered the German fleet to disengage and steam south for the safety of the German minefields. Despite a series of bitterly fought artillery duels, the bulk of the German fleet was able to escape. The British lost 14 ships, the Germans lost 11 ships. A total of 8,500 sailors had perished. Both sides claimed that they had won the battle. British naval supremacy had been indented, but the German High Seas Fleet never again ventured out to challenge the Royal Navy during World War I. In August 1914, the German Navy possessed 33 submarines. 5 of them were short-range defensive types, and the rest were highly effective long-range boats. The first attack against merchant ships occurred on October 14th. The submarine U-17 stopped and searched the vessel. In accordance with the prevailing rules, the crew was transferred to lifeboats and the seacocks were opened. U-17 never actually fired on the British cargo ship. These were the rules of civilized warfare. They wouldn't last the month. On October 20th, U-24 became the first submarine to attack while submerged without warning, torpedoing the steamship Admiral Gatone. In February 1915, the German government began the commencement of unrestricted submarine warfare against all Allied shipping. A war zone was declared in all the waters surrounding Great Britain. Any hostile cargo ships in this area were subject to unannounced attack by German U-boats. A narrow corridor running across the Atlantic to Land's End was set aside for neutral shipping, but the Germans had more than cargo ships in their periscope sights. Passenger ships had continued to ply their trade between Britain and the United States since the start of the war. One such vessel was the Lusitania. She made regular transatlantic crossings between New York and Liverpool via the Irish port of Queenstown in Southern Ireland. The Lusitania was, for her time, a big liner. She displaced over 30,000 tons, was 787 feet in length, and carried a crew of 700. This floating luxury hotel, launched in 1907, was registered in Britain to the Cunard Line and was therefore considered a legitimate target by Germany. She had a cruising speed of 25 knots, 3 times the speed of a submerged submarine, and she was believed to be fast enough to outrun any U-boat attack. On May 1, 1915, the Lusitania was preparing to sail from New York. Ominously, next to the Cunard announcement of her departure in the newspapers, the German embassy published a warning that ships flying the British flag were subject to attack. The director of the Port of New York inspected the Lusitania for guns or munitions and announced that there were none aboard. Her 1,300 passengers included 159 Americans. Approaching Ireland's south coast, the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, reduced speed to 18 knots in order to make port at Queenstown on the high tide. At 2 p.m. on May 7th, the German submarine U-20, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Walter Schweiger, fired a single torpedo at the Lusitania's starboard side. It exploded in the boiler room and the ship sank in 18 minutes. Among the 1,198 passengers and crew killed were 128 Americans. American public opinion was outraged. President Wilson attempted to maintain America's neutrality, but in the face of overwhelming public protest, he was forced to warn Germany that any additional attacks on passenger liners would prompt an American response. In January 1917, Berlin raised the stakes in the Atlantic submarine war yet again, advising the United States that Germany was about to commence unrestricted submarine warfare against any nation, neutral or belligerent. In announcing the inclusion of neutral ships as legitimate targets, the German government knew that it would likely cause the entry of the United States in the war on the side of the Allies. Berlin gambled that it could knock Great Britain out of the war before the United States could mobilize its armed forces and intervene in Europe with sufficient force to make a difference. German war planners had calculated if the U-boat campaign could sink an average of 500,000 tons of shipping per month, Great Britain would be forced to quit the war within 6 months. The gamble almost worked. In February 1917, 414,000 tons of shipping was sunk. The losses increased to 500,000 tons in March and ballooned to 860,000 tons in April. Then, just as it seemed that Great Britain's doom was sealed, the Royal Navy announced that henceforth merchant ships would be accompanied across the Atlantic in convoys protected by fast destroyers. By the summer of 1917, shipping losses were down sharply, and they continued to decline over the course of 1918. Of the 8,194 ships that traversed the Atlantic in convoys in the summer of 1917, only 27 were lost to U-boat attacks. Great Britain had won the war for the Atlantic, but in the spring of 1917, the U-boat campaign had come perilously close to bringing London to its knees. Inventors had been experimenting with heavier-than-air manned flight for several centuries before the onset of World War I. Most of these craft were strange and bizarre machines. Few of them ever made it off the ground. Those that did only managed it for a few seconds. It wasn't until 1903 that the Wright brothers in the United States achieved the goal of sustained powered flight. Within 6 years, on July 23, 1909, the French aviator Louis Blériot successfully flew across the English Channel. The barrier of the tempestuous Channel had been breached. Great Britain's sense of splendid isolation from continental Europe was no more. In little more than a decade, the primitive plane flown at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina would revolutionize warfare, creating for the first time a three-dimensional battlefield. At the start of World War I, the use of aircraft was limited to observation and to taking photographs of the trench lines and rear areas for later analysis. As each side became more belligerent, the pilots and observers began to arm themselves. At first, only pistols and rifles were used. Grenades and grappling hooks were also employed. Soon, machine guns were deployed, and an era of air combat began. It was this image of swooping, diving, machine-gunning aircraft that summed up the popular perception of air warfare in World War I. For the pilots, the reality of air combat wasn't quite so glamorous. Without a parachute, if a plane was damaged or caught fire, the pilot's only options were to jump or hope he could safely land his plane. Most pilots had less than 20 hours of training before being deployed to the front. The average life expectancy of a World War I pilot was less than 3 weeks. As the importance of air warfare grew, so too did the fame surrounding the men who flew these machines. Ace fighter pilots came to be regarded as heroes. Publicized in newspapers, they soon became larger-than-life characters. One of the first aces of the German Air Force was Lieutenant Max Immelmann. Flying a Fokker E-1 Eindecker, he scored a total of 17 kills before being killed in June 1916. He is remembered for developing the Immelmann turn. The maneuver allowed him to use the speed of a diving attack to loop and half-roll to regain height and engage again. The Immelmann turn is still a classic maneuver in air combat. One of the most famous of all the World War I aces was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. During the month of Bloody April in 1917, he downed 22 British aircraft. On April 21, 1918, with 80 victories to his credit, von Richthofen was wounded over the River Somme. He managed to land his plane but died almost instantly. The Red Baron had come down in a sector controlled by the Australians. They gave him a funeral with full military honours. The highest scoring Allied ace was Captain René Fonck, with a score of 75 combat kills. Flying a Spad 7 and later a Spad 13, he survived the war unscathed. Unlike most aces, not only was he never wounded, but amazingly, not a single enemy bullet ever struck his aircraft. The highest-scoring British ace was Major Edward Manock, with 73 air victories. Manock was killed in July 1918. Right behind him was Canadian Lieutenant Colonel William Billy Bishop, with 72 kills. Bishop was awarded the Victoria Cross and survived the war. During World War I, the United States did not produce any of its own combat aircraft, relying instead on British and French aircraft to equip the squadrons of the Army Air Service. Captain Edward "Eddie" Rickenbacker was America's top ace, with 26 air victories to his credit. Formerly a racing car driver and designer, Rickenbacker had great difficulty joining the air service because of his lack of formal schooling. He was finally accepted into the 94th Aero Squadron, the Hat in the Ring Squadron, which he went on to command. In 1916, although the United States was not yet in the war, many American volunteers were flying for Allied air squadrons. In March of that year, the French organized Squadron No. 124, called the Escadrille Américaine. The Germans objected to the name because at the time, America had not yet entered the war, so the squadron was renamed the Lafayette Escadrille. The members of the squadron, with their mixture of gaudy uniforms, their lion cub mascots named Whiskey and Soda, and their reputation in the flesh pots of Paris, quickly caught the public's imagination. They came to represent the adventure and the romance of air combat in the Great War. The reality was neither adventurous nor romantic. World War I brought unprecedented changes across the social fabric of Europe and North America. For the first time, women joined the industrial labor force in unprecedented numbers. Their participation would prove crucial to replace the men fighting on the front lines and ensure the continued production of the stream of war materials needed by the troops. Having done their part to win the war, the women's suffrage movement would take on a new strength and purpose that would ultimately result in the granting of women's suffrage in most of the developed world. Throughout the length of Europe, national patriotism was increasingly tempered by the realization that it was the reigning elites, their decisions and actions, that were ultimately responsible for precipitating the catastrophe of the war. By what right did the old order rule? Judging by the war and its outcome, certainly not because of their wisdom, experience, or prudence. As the legitimacy of the old order came into question, the bonds of subservience and obligation that had supported it steadily unraveled. There was no way that the divine rights of emperors and czars could be reconciled with the rights of the working man. One would have to go. 4 imperial dynasties would vanish in the wake of the war. The first of the royal dynasties to fall was the House of Romanov. It would not be the last. Ensconced in the royal palace in Petrograd, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were almost completely out of touch with ordinary Russians. Cocooned and isolated within the royal court, they were oblivious to the enormous cost being inflicted by the war and the economic chaos it was leaving in its wake. The couple had 5 children, 4 girls and a boy. Tragically, the heir to the throne, the Tsarevich Alexei, was a hemophiliac. He was subject to uncontrollable bleeding after even the slightest fall or bruise. Desperate to find a means of dealing with her son's hemophilia, the Tsarina Alexandria had fallen progressively under the malign influence of a purportedly holy man from Siberia. Grigory Rasputin has been described as a psychic, a mystic, and the mad Siberian monk. He had a near-hypnotic influence on the Tsarina, and through her was able to influence government policy. As the war news got progressively worse, the House of Romanov began to totter, and Rasputin's divisive role in the royal household would tip it into the dustbin of history. By the spring of 1917, the seemingly never-ending defeats of Russian armies by the Germans had left Russia in chaos. Russian industry was failing, beset by manpower and raw material shortages. The cities were desperately short of food and fuel. Repeated requisitioning of draft animals for the army had led to a collapse of the transportation system. Russia was on the verge of collapse. In February 1917, spontaneous demonstrations had started in Petrograd and other cities throughout Western Russia. The protesters had demanded bread and an immediate cessation to the war. The Petrograd garrison had at first opened fire on the protesters. Then they joined them and called for the removal of the Tsar. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II had been abdicated and was put under house arrest. The Romanov dynasty was finished. The next day, a new provisional government was announced. It too would be short-lived. On November 7, 1917, a second revolution erupted. Well-trained Red Guard units under the control of the Bolsheviks took over the banks and key strategic transport and communication facilities. The members of the provisional government were arrested. The next day, Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, declared, "We shall now start to construct the new socialist order." The world's first communist government had been established. The entry of the United States on behalf of the Allies was one of the pivotal events of World War I. Suddenly, America's industrial might and financial resources became available to the Allies. More importantly, the powerful American Navy was now available to safeguard the Atlantic crossings. The Allies had gained an important new ally, not to mention the availability of millions of new recruits to take up arms against their German foe. The United States had issued a declaration of neutrality at the outbreak of the war in August 1914. Wilson had spent the period from 1914 to 1917 trying to keep the United States out of the war. As the war progressed, the goal of keeping America neutral became progressively harder. Three factors: unrestricted submarine warfare, German-led sabotage of American munitions plants, and the Zimmermann telegram would ultimately precipitate an American declaration of war. The sinking of the Lusitania had prompted President Wilson to warn Berlin that any further sinking of passenger ships or neutral merchantmen would force the United States to take action. The declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against any ship, belligerent or neutral, in the waters surrounding Great Britain had prompted Wilson to sever diplomatic relations with Berlin. Still, he stopped short of an outright declaration of war. In February, American public opinion was further inflamed by the loss of 4 U.S. merchant ships and 15 American lives to German submarine attacks. Slowly but surely, the United States was inching closer to war. From the start of World War I in 1914, there had been an active German spy and sabotage ring in the United States. Throughout 1916, there had been a series of fires and explosions in facilities producing war supplies for the Allies. The worst incident had occurred in July in Jersey City Harbor, the Black Tom Island explosion. The Black Tom facility was a major munitions depot on the East Coast. On July 30th, approximately 900 tons of explosives and detonating fuses scheduled for shipment to the Allies in Europe mysteriously blew up. German involvement was suspected but never proven. Acts of sabotage continued throughout 1916 and 1917. Anti-German feeling continued to grow. America was inching closer to a declaration of war. On January 16, 1917, the British intercepted and decoded a telegram from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. In the telegram, Zimmermann proposed that in the event of war with the United States, Germany and Mexico should form an alliance. Germany would fund Mexico's conflict with the US in return for the use of Mexican ports as submarine bases. With victory achieved, Mexico would regain her lost territories in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. The revelation of the contents of the Zimmermann telegram inflamed American public opinion and added fuel to the rising anti-German sentiment. Neutrality was now impossible. American public opinion would not stand for it any further. On April 2nd, President Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. America was now at war. The arrival of American troops on European soil had changed the rules of the game. The German General Staff was convinced that the only route to a German victory was to launch a major offensive along the Western Front before the added strength of American forces became overwhelming. With the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on March 3, 1918, Russia had withdrawn from the war. 33 additional German divisions were now available for deployment on the Western Front. Germany now had 192 divisions, almost 2 million men on the Western Front. The Allies had 178 divisions. Their armies were sorely depleted and were suffering from low morale and a lack of unified command. On May 27th, the Germans launched their spring offensive. In the words of British Field Marshal Douglas Haig, it was a gambler's throw. It came very close to succeeding. The assault began by an artillery bombardment from 4,000 guns along a 24-mile front. Simultaneously, the Germans launched a gas attack. The British positions along the front were virtually wiped out by the opening barrage. The attack was followed by an advance of 17 divisions of infantry commanded by Crown Prince Wilhelm through the gap that had been blasted in the British line. In 6 hours, they reached the River Aisne. By the end of the first day, they had arrived at the River Vella. In 3 days, the Germans had taken 50,000 prisoners and 800 guns. Allied armies began to withdraw in the direction of Paris. Desperate for reinforcements to block the German advance, the overall Allied commander, General Foch, pleaded with General Pershing to commit his American divisions. American troops were rushed in to seal the breach and check the German advance at Cantigny and Belleau Wood. The Americans were finally in the war. Along the front, German troops continued to advance towards the Marne and beyond it, Paris. By June 3rd, advance units of the German army were within 60 miles of Paris. On July 15th, German forces launched a new attack against French lines at Reims. Their intent was to split the French forces, cross the Marne, and begin the final drive on Paris. Initially, it seemed that the German army would succeed. The German offensive broke through the French lines and crossed the Marne on a 20-mile front east of Château-Thierry. 6 divisions of the German 7th Army established a vast bridgehead on either side of the village of Dormans, 4 miles deep and 9 miles wide. In Paris, panic gripped the capital. There was talk that Prime Minister Clemenceau and his government would abandon the capital. The Germans were now less than 50 miles from the center of Paris. The Allied line was wavering. Once again, it was here on the banks of the River Marne that the outcome of the war would be settled. The Allies rushed reinforcements to the Marne. On July 17th, French, British, American, and Italian troops managed to halt the German advance. The Allied lines had wavered, but they had held. Once again, the German advance had been halted and turned back within sight of Paris. With all hope of a German victory now gone, the beaten and demoralized German armies began to withdraw. The Second Battle of the Marne was an important Allied victory. The Allies had inflicted casualties on the Germans of 168,000. Allied losses were approximately 131,000. More importantly, the victory gained on the Marne marked the end of a long, unbroken string of German victories on the Western Front. After the Marne, the Allies would enjoy an unbroken string of victories. Marshal Ferdinand Foch lost no time in capitalizing on the Allied victory on the Marne. On the 8th of August, the British Fourth Army broke through the German lines at Amiens. General Erich Ludendorff, Chief of Staff of the German Army, described the battle as the Black Day of the German Army. British forces quickly overran German rear positions, sparking panic and confusion in the German lines. For the first time in the war, there was a mass surrender of German troops. The Allies took 12,000 prisoners and captured 450 guns. The Germans rapidly retreated until they reached defensive positions on the previously established Siegfried and Hindenburg lines. Within a matter of days, all of the gains of the German spring offensive had been reversed. The continued Allied advance marked the end of the static trench warfare that had dominated the conflict on the Western Front. Foch now launched a series of attacks on the German lines in the west, while in the east, General Pershing and the US First Army prepared to launch an attack against the German lines in the Argonne. The plan was to simultaneously break through the German lines on the east and west and encircle the German army in a giant pincer movement. Initially, it seemed that the plan was going to work. In the north, British forces managed to turn the right flank of the German army, with General Pershing's troops advancing through the Argonne. The Germans were threatened with a double envelopment of the entire German army on the Western Front. In the German High Command, there was panic. Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and the Kaiser agreed that it was time to ask for an armistice. In the meantime, in hope of getting better terms and protecting the German army from encirclement, he rushed troops to the Argonne to block Pershing's advance. On October 8th, British and Canadian forces had broken through the Hindenburg line. German forces along the Western Front were on the verge of collapse. This new setback persuaded the German General Staff and the German government that the war had to be brought to an end. Prince Maximilian, a moderate politician, was appointed Chancellor of Germany and tasked with negotiating an armistice. Fighting continued, but the road to an armistice and the eventual end of the road was now clear. Peace had not yet arrived, but it was drawing closer. With the failure of the German spring offensive in 1918, the focus of the German army had shifted to one of avoiding defeat and positioning itself to secure the best possible peace terms. The German military was still a formidable force with millions of men under arms. The German high seas fleet remained intact, and the submarine fleet, though suffering mounting losses, was still a considerable threat to Allied shipping. The successful Allied counteroffensive was rapidly stripping the German government of its negotiating options. The German position was further undermined by the deteriorating economic situation on the home front. 4 years of the British blockade, the ever-mounting losses of material, and rampant food shortages were creating a chaotic, unstable situation. The German people were at the breaking point. Their willingness to continue to endure the hardships necessary to continue the war was at their limit. Their willingness to obey the Kaiser and his generals was rapidly dissipating. In scenes reminiscent of Russia the year before, a variety of left-wing groups were openly advocating an immediate cessation to the fighting. The deteriorating conditions on the battlefield, coupled with the increasingly chaotic domestic situation, meant that Germany's ability to continue to wage war was evaporating. The German government and its military had run out of time. On the evening of the 7th of November 1918, a convoy of cars carrying the German delegation was escorted by the French military across the Allied lines. Their destination was a railroad car in the forest of Comte Gagny. Awaiting them there was Field Marshal General Foch, accompanied by a number of British and French commanders. The terms demanded by the Allies for an armistice included the withdrawal of all German forces to the east of the Rhine and the Allied occupation of the Rhineland. The Allied naval blockade would continue until a formal peace treaty had been signed. In the meantime, the sailors of the German High Seas Fleet had mutinied. In Berlin, ever larger crowds were demanding the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm. Bolshevik-inspired demonstrations were calling for an immediate end to the war and the creation of a communist state. On the 9th of November 1918, the Kaiser signed a letter of abdication. The next day, he boarded a train and went into exile in the Netherlands. The last Hohenzollern Emperor of Germany was gone. On the same day, concurrent with the abdication of the Kaiser, the Reichstag declared Germany a republic. The socialist Friedrich Ebert was appointed the Chancellor. Fearful of a Bolshevik revolution in Germany, he instructed the negotiators in Comte Gagny to get a settlement while there is still something to save. At 5 a.m. on the morning of November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. It would go into effect at 11 a.m. Paris time, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At the appointed hour, the battlefield fell silent. Everyone waited to see what would happen. Nothing did. As the troops emerged from their trenches, no man's land ceased to exist. There was a general order on both sides that there was to be no fraternization. It was ignored virtually everywhere. All along the front lines, spontaneous celebrations erupted. The fighting had stopped. Germany had signed an armistice, but she still had to agree to a peace treaty. The peace conference opened in Versailles, just outside Paris, on January 18th. President Wilson was there, as were the three other Allied leaders: Lloyd George of Great Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy. Also in attendance were representatives of 27 other Allied powers. There were also 3,000 lobbyists, including Prince Faisal, T.E. Lawrence, and an unknown Vietnamese nationalist there to lobby for the independence of his homeland, named Ho Chi Minh. No representatives of either the new Soviet government or the German government were invited to attend. For 3 months, Versailles formed the center of a sort of world government. The map of Europe was redrawn. A host of new states emerged from the remnants of the former Austrian-Hungarian and Russian empires. German colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, as well as the Mideast territories of the former Ottoman Empire, were parceled out among the victors. Most importantly, the terms of the new League of Nations, an international organization of member states tasked with preventing war through collective security and disarmament, was finalized. On May 7, 1919, the German delegation was summoned from their hotel under armed guard to have the terms of the treaty read to them. They were pointedly told that there would not be any negotiation. They could accept the terms as offered or prepare for a resumption of hostilities. They angrily denounced the harsh terms of the treaty and were granted time to return to Berlin to consult with the German government in Weimar. After several high-ranking resignations in protest, realizing that they no longer had a choice in the matter, the German government capitulated. A new foreign minister, Hermann Müller, landed the thankless job of returning to Versailles. On June 28, 1919, the delegates assembled for the signing of the peace treaty. It was exactly 5 years to the day that a Bosnian student named Gavrilo Princip had fatally shot the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. This was the same hall where 48 years earlier, the German Chancellor Bismarck had orchestrated the proclamation of Wilhelm I as Emperor of the new German Empire. The treaty was 80,000 words long. Germany had to admit her guilt, the so-called war guilt clause, for causing the war. Her standing army was to be reduced to no more than 100,000 men. Her navy was reduced to a token coastal defense force, and she was barred from having an air force. Germany was forced to relinquish control of all her overseas territories, and she had to pay huge reparations. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine would be returned to France. Portions of eastern Germany, including the German port of Danzig on the Baltic, would be added to the new state of Poland. President Wilson's dream of a League of Nations would be established, but Germany would be excluded from participation. While Paris and London celebrated the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, already there were those, among them the economist John Maynard Keynes, a member of the British delegation to the peace conference, who denounced the harsh terms of what they called the false peace. The shared German resentment resulting from 16 million war dead, the 20 million casualties, the crippling indemnity and war debts, plus the widespread hardships that had resulted from the Allied blockade, could not and would not be so easily forgotten. Among those who criticized the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was a young German soldier who had been wounded at the Battle of the Somme and who had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class for bravery. His name was Adolf Hitler. Within 20 years, the drums of war would beat again. The war to end all war would do anything but that.